Hi, guys. How you doing? This may not be relevant, but I'm just kidding. Had you there for a second, didn't I? Thanks for having me out here. It's actually great to be back in Dublin. I landed last night around 4 p.m. And as I got off the plane, the driver met me. He's like, "Hey, I bet you thought you landed in Spain, didn't you?" No. But I appreciate the fact that you guys are having great weather and that you're actually sitting indoors instead of enjoying it out there. So we're going to talk about a number of things. The way I want to organize this day is in two parts, conveniently matched to the schedule. In the first part, what I want to do is talk about some things that are on my mind. So just kind of walk through some things that I've been thinking about lately that relates to design, that relate to mobile, that relate to a lot of the cross-device stuff that you guys have heard about over the past few days. And I'll just sort of walk through a bunch of stuff. And hopefully, as I do, ideas will come into your mind, questions will come up. Because the second half, after we come back from the break, I'll actually ask you guys what you want to talk about, what's on your minds. And I will respond in turn, showing you answers to hopefully your questions, and we can dig into the things that you care about more than the things that I care about. But the first hour is mine, so we'll do it that way. And to kick things off, I have, of course, an intro animation. So if the beatbox didn't wake you up, I didn't know there was going to be beatboxing. I thought this was the only chance I had to wake you. Conveniently, that was not the case. Okay, so in order to kind of start this story off, I want to take us back to 1952. In 1952, at the Corning Glass Works, which is actually out in New Jersey, there was a chemist by the name of Don Stuckey. And Don Stuckey was working with glass, as you do at a company like Corning Glass Works. And he was running an experiment on photosensitive glass. And the crux of this experiment was he put this photosensitive glass inside of a furnace, as you do, and he intended to run the experiment at 600 degrees Celsius. Now, what Don didn't know was that there was a faulty controller on this particular furnace. And instead of running this experiment at 600 degrees Celsius, Don actually ran the experiment at 900 degrees Celsius. As soon as he realized this, he sort of scrambled over to the furnace and tried to pull this substance out of the furnace. And what he noticed was that photosensitive glass he had put in there had turned kind of milky white. Looked quite strange. So he pulled on the thing to try and take it out. And as he tried to take it out of the furnace, he sort of bumbled it and it began to fall to the ground. So what do you do when a big hot piece of glass is about to hit the ground? You kind of brace yourself, right? So Don braced for impact. And what happened was the glass hit the ground and bounced. By accident, Don had invented the first synthetic glass ceramic. And you may not know what that is, what you care, but if any of you have ever had something like this in your kitchen, this is a Corningware. This is very popular cookware. It goes in microwaves, ovens. And essentially, this was called pyroceram. This is what came from Don's invention. The photosensitive glass that he created was lighter than aluminum, but harder than high carbon steel, and many, many times stronger than the original glass that Corning was making back then. So it's made its way to everything from microwavable dishes to the tips of missiles. Those cones, even till today, are still made from pyroceram because it's so strong and so light. So needless to say, if you've got a product that can be put on the top of missiles and put inside of microwaves, there's a lot of applications for this stuff. So pyroceram turned out to be very big business for Corning. They were making a lot of money off of this. And they decided that, hey, there's probably something to this stronger glass idea. So they launched an internal R&D project, and they codenamed it 0317. And the intent of this internal R&D was to find even tougher glass, really, really strong glass. It's tougher than the stuff that Don had come up with. And so about 10 years later, 1962, this project had made some advances. If you look at traditional glass, glass can take about 7,000 pounds per square inch. It's pretty strong stuff. 0317, which is the code name for this project that they are working on, could take 100,000 pounds per square inch. So really, really, really strong stuff we're talking about here. And Corning thought they had another hit on their hands, right? They were very excited about this stuff. Pyroceram turned out to be such a big deal, they thought, hey, now we have even stronger glass. We'll go and make another market out of these things. But they spent a lot of time trying to commercialize it. One of the places that they were very excited about was the automotive industry. So they'd put this 0317 glass material in automobile windshields, and then they'd run it through testing. And what would happen is the glass would not break, but the human beings who hit it would. So that didn't go over so well. And after, roughly 9 years of trying to commercialize and market the stuff that they had worked on for 10 years, they ultimately gave up. They couldn't find a market, they couldn't find buyers, and so they took this product, 0317, they put it on the shelf in 1971. It's about 19 years after Don's invention. And it sat on a shelf from 1971 until about 2007, when this man, Steve Jobs, walked into the corner office of Wendell P. Weeks's, the corner office of Wendell P. Weeks, who's the Corning CEO. He still is the Corning CEO. He's been it for many, many years. And Steve Jobs walked into Wendell's office and said, hey, I need you to give me millions of square feet of ultra-thin, ultra-strong glass. That doesn't exist yet. And whether it was the fact that Steve Jobs was in his office or whether he actually knew what he was doing, Wendell agreed. Knowing sort of some of the history behind Steve Jobs, I assume it was actually more like, hey, you, jerky, give me some glass, right? He's not the kindest man sometimes when negotiating. So maybe Wendell was intimidated. But he didn't know how he would do it, but he agreed, again, maybe by sheer force of Steve's personality. He said he'd get it done. And what they did is they actually went back and revived this project 0317. Brought it back off the shelf, renamed it Gorilla Glass, and by May 2007, 3 months after Jobs made his demands, they had produced 7 football fields worth of Gorilla Glass. You guys all know what happened after that. Gorilla Glass was the material that launched on the first iPhone back in June of 2007. Right? It was the thing that sort of kicked off the multi-touch consumer smartphone revolution. Since then, Gorilla Glass has come a long way, and that number of 7 football fields, while at the time was actually very impressive to go from 0 to that number so quickly, today's number pales. Today there are 3 billion consumer devices with Gorilla Glass on them. Everything from smart watches to smart TVs to laptops to tablets to smartphones, and those numbers are projected to double over the next couple years as more and more of these devices come online. And the trend that you see with Gorilla Glass is actually exemplary of the broader trend. One of the nice things that Corning does in their quarterly earnings is they actually talk about a very interesting metric, which I find kind of fascinating, and that is global LCD screen sales by square feet. This is sort of fascinating. If you trend screen sales by square feet from 2007 up until the end of last year, they've continued to grow over year, crossing the 4 billion marker last year. Now, to put this into perspective, this is just a chart that's got some numbers on it. What does it mean? It means this, that half a square foot of LCD screen is sold for every human being on this planet every year. And that number keeps growing. So in 2 years, every single person on this planet has a square foot of screen associated with them. Now that's a heck of a lot of screens, right? A lot of screens. And we're not just talking about glass itself. Why is Luke so obsessed with Corning and Gorilla Glass and this growth? We're talking about what's behind it. As Apple's CEO Tim Cook says, we care about that glass because we understand that it's the way people get to the software. And increasingly to the internet is kind of the way I'd put it. And more so their lives, right? It's behind that piece of glass that you connect with people, that you talk to people, that you buy things, that you find the way to this venue, that you find your way back home from this venue, that you draw up a boarding pass to get you on the tin can that will fly you back home from this venue. All this stuff that the ringtone comes up from behind of. Good ringtone, by the way. So Apple makes a lot of those 3 billion devices with Gorilla Glass on them. And as he points out, it's a really important piece to it. In fact, in this world of glass that we're living in, which I really like this sort of analogy, in this world of glass, online time is screen time. The way people access digital information is through these glasses. So as people who make software, websites, apps, all these kinds of things, we sort of need an intimate knowledge of screens. And I equate this to understanding your medium. I'll show an image a little bit later that hammers this point home, but this is what the product experience appears on, this variety of screens covered by glass. And so we sort of have to understand a little bit about that and how people use it and how it relates to their lives so that we can put the appropriate stuff behind the glass so we can make the right kinds of software experiences. Now, when I say we need an intimate knowledge of screens, it actually turns out this can get pretty darn complicated. So I don't know, those of you who follow along with CES, the Consumer Electronics Show, it's a really big deal. Worldwide in Vegas, hundreds of thousands of people descend on Vegas and start showing off electronics of every size and shape. This happened just about 2 months ago. And let me just show you some of the variety of screens that came out just during that week of CES. So, of course, you had a number of smartphones come out. But the variance between those smartphones is pretty stark. You've got things like the Samsung Galaxy S6, which is a 5-inch phone, 256,000 by 1,440 pixels, 557 pixels per inch. That is crazy high resolution on a tiny little device. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But then you also had kind of low-end things like this 3.5-inch Firefox OS phone, which just has a 480 by 320 screen. That's the screen that came out back in June 2007 on the iPhone, right? 480 by 320. But in addition to that, you also had a bunch of screens that looked like this. Really small, 1 to 2-inch kind of screens. In some cases, barely a display. In other cases, a round display. Again, bringing digital information to people through a screen. And then you had these kinds of screens, too. The HTC Vive, the Gear VR Innovator, very similar to the Oculus VR thing. And these screens are measured a little bit differently. Do they have single or dual vision on them? What kind of frames per second do they run at? So resolution's measured a little bit differently. So when I talk about understanding screens, it can get really complicated real fast. Just tune in on every given week, and you'll see a whole bunch of this stuff, right? All kinds of different mobile devices, and tablets, and laptops, and lablets, and fabtops, and phablets, and dingbops. I don't even know what to call them anymore. Wearables, VR, all kinds of things. Good news is there's actually some stuff that we can extract from this. So I like to show this chart a lot because it puts things into perspective. If you look since kind of the birth of the graphical web, so the graphical web browser that kicked off a lot of the things we do back in 1995, and CSA Mosaic, this is the chart of PC growth globally. So this is how many personal computers were sold across the world. And that line doesn't look that impressive, does it? But this is the line. This line is the reason you're all sitting in this building today, because Google grew off the back of this line. eBay grew off the back of this line. Yahoo, you name it, Facebook, right? All these companies grew off the back of this line. Anything that had a digital experience essentially brought it to people through the PC. And I like to show this chart because I always lay this one on it, which really shows where we're headed today with mobile. And the point I want to make here is while there's all this diversity of screens with wearables, with smartphones, with VR and all this stuff, not all these screens are created equal. And so what I want to do is dissect this line for a second and articulate what I mean by not all the screens are equal. There's a particular kind of screen that we should really, really care about a ton. Let me illustrate that. So here's kind of the traditional screens. I'm going to leave wearables and VR and TVs off for a minute. This is the sort of stuff that most of you with either a website or an app are building things for, right? From the smartphone up to the desktop. A couple of years ago, I would have just shown this stuff on the right, but now pretty much everyone's playing this whole space. So let's open this up a second and let's look at that smartphone and tablet line. And that smartphone and tablet line is that one up and to the right, right? Let me remind you again of that. Here's our PCs. That's essentially desktops and laptops. Here's the smartphone and tablets line. So we're going to unpack that one because this is the big up and to the right crazy line. And I also really like this animation because I can go, let's unpack this, and it looks really cool. Somebody record that. Is there a video over there? Let's unpack this. Tweetable moment. Okay, so between smartphones and tablets here, Flurry, which runs a lot of analytics, they dissected this space and they looked at the billion or so devices that they're on and broke it down. And they broke things down by small-sized smartphones, so under 3 inches, medium-sized smartphones up to 5 inches, phablets. I think this term is going away now. Thank God. Right? Like, does anybody call it a phablet anymore? Is that a thing? Hopefully it's just gone away. Small-sized tablets and full-sized tablets. And this data is about, I don't know, a year and a half or so old here. So I'll back it up with some newer stuff in a second. But it's interesting to see what they found. Because when they looked at device models back then, about a year and a half ago, what they noted was there's still a decent number of small-sized smartphones. But it's really the bulk of devices are in this 3 to 5 inch area. So that's cool. This sort of tells you what kind of devices are out there. It doesn't tell you how much they get used, though, which is a much more interesting question. So when they looked at that same data and instead sliced it by active users, what they found was while there are a decent number of small-sized smartphones, that number essentially fell in half, right, in terms of active users. There's a lot out there, but they don't get used that much. And the number on medium-sized smartphones, I think it jumped from 69 to about 72%. So not only is there a lot of them there, but they actually get used a lot. Full-size tablets actually get used a lot too. It went from about 7% of devices to 13% of active users. Now that's just individual users. What about how active are they? So we can look at, again, slice the data another way is looking at sessions. How active are they? Which devices are people most active on? And what you'll see is small-sized smartphones fell again from 16% of devices to 4% of sessions. Medium-sized smartphones grew again, and tablets and the rest sort of stayed the same. So not only do we have the most of our devices over here in this medium area, we actually have the most active users and the most sessions. Now, I say this data is about a year and a half old, and we'll unpack it a little bit more, because since then we've had bigger phones, right? And it was like, well, what happens when the iPhone 6 came out, right? How does this change? Not mentioning that there was large-size Android phones for quite a while, but still, we'll take it at face value. What did the iPhone 6 do to this? And the other thing people bring up is, well, phones keep getting bigger, which is true. If you track things down from like 1993, which is, I believe, when Guns N' Roses was quite popular. Just saying. Doesn't sound as good on the lap mic, does it? No? I have to try it with one of those real mics later. So if you follow it from 1993 up until 2015, you can see average phone size basically going up. In fact, right now we're about 4.8 inches in terms of average phone size. And you can see where this started-ish on the modern smartphone era, right? Again, about 2007-ish or so. It's 3.5 inches. And you have things like the Galaxy Note 2 up here, which was one of these moments where big smartphones really started to take center stage. And so has this had an impact? Has this growth in screen size actually changed dramatically which devices get used the most? And looking at the beginning of 2014, you can see there has been a little bit of impact. The dark green line is the second quarter, the light green line is the first quarter. And you can see gradually the 3 to 4 inch range is going down a bit, to the 4 to 4.5 inches going up, and the 5 to 6 inches going up. Well, there's some trends here. Looking at this data in Q1 of 2015, so to really modernize it, we can actually look across regions too. Because what's interesting, this isn't consistent across all regions. And what you can see here is in the US, right, 4 to about 5 inches is really the dominant form factor still. So a total of what, 54 or so there? In Europe, you've got a similar story, 4 to 4.5, 5 to 4.5 to 5, so between 4 and 5 inches. Asia, as perhaps some of your instincts would tell you, some of the larger size phones are actually more popular in those regions, right? You can see the 5 to 5.5, the 5.5 to 6 inch range. In fact, in Korea, home of Samsung, the larger size smartphones have been popular for quite a while. And then if you break this down a little deeper, you start looking at South America and Africa and Oceania, you see a similar kind of thing where the range extends up until about 5.5 inches or so. So when you look at that smartphones and tablets line going up and to the right, what we really mean there by the smartphone is this 4 to 5.5 inch-ish kind of device. Now, there are a couple other things to know about this device. We took a look at, the guys over at Accenture sent me an analysis that they did around about 5.2 billion samples of screen views in their index. They do this device index thing. And they looked across smartphones, and they tried to understand, well, what are the most common orientations? How are people actually using these things? So you got these 4.5 to 5 inch phones, but how are people actually using them? And, you know, are they kind of looking like this? Or are they looking like this? And it turns out 94% of the time, they're actually inside of this vertical portrait mode. Right? They're in this vertical view. So most of the time, that's the experience. And one more thing to bring to bear on this, and then I'll explain my point in half a second, is if most of these vertical orientations are in portrait mode, how are people interacting with it? Right? Like, what's their interaction paradigm? You can do the one-handed kind of grip, like so. You can do one-handed and then bring in another hand to help you make your way around the screen. Or you can do what for many years we referred to as the crackberry prayer, which is you're in a meeting. You're yeah, huh? Yeah. Oh, yeah, it's a big deal to do that. So my friend Stephen Huber went and did a lot of live research on this. Again, it was a little while back, but these numbers haven't changed so much as you saw in the previous things. And what he found in his observations is half the time people were using a smartphone, and this is through direct observations in the real world, about half the time they were using this one-handed grip. Another 36% of the time, they had two hands on the device. And then 15% of the time, they were doing the crackberry prayer. And that was based off around 1,300 observations of people, again, out and about using these things in their external environments. And then if you break down this middle one, there we go, you can see that there's actually two kinds of grips. There's the one thumb, one hand grip, and then there's the one hand and then using an index finger grip. And when he looked at this, he found the majority of people, when they were doing two hands things, were still using a thumb, and only about 28% were using another kind of finger. So if you split this up and you take that original 50%, what that means is 75% of the time we're dealing with a thumb. And again, let's talk about why that matters. That matters because when you look at this line, and I showed you all kinds of crazy devices, right? I showed you VR stuff, smartphones, wearables, TVs, who knows. When you actually look at this line and you see this huge growth, what's the thing that actually stands out? If I were to put kind of a boundary line around the primary screen, the primary glass today for getting to that world of software, so that digital world that we all spend probably too much time in, it kind of to me looks like this. It's about a 4 to 5.5 inch screen. It's in portrait mode, and people are using it in one hand. All right, this is how I would sort of characterize the prototypical mobile device. In fact, half of you have one up right now and are taking pictures of this screen. So there's my evidence right there. And why does this matter? This matters because when you do design work, you really want to understand how does the device relate to the human, right? The human has the device. The human goes online to do things. What is the relationship between the human and that device? How do they use stuff? And to illustrate, what I want to show you is me stalking a woman on an airplane. So let me show you what I mean before you freak out. So here I am behind this woman on an airplane. I observed her browsing her phone. And you can see she's got her hand in the phone. She's using one thumb, and she's probably on Facebook based on it. But so she's like scroll, 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 tap, just tap, just tap, 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 tap that link, tap, 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 oh, hell, I'll go back to seeing cat photos. Now, what do you notice outside of her lovely hands? You notice that this is the reality of how people use these devices, right? They got them in their hand, they're kind of flicking, and why can't she tap on those things? Because somebody didn't think about the size of her thumb on those touch targets, right? Why did she have to pull in her fingers? Why did she have to move to this two-handed grip a second ago? So scrolling's working fine, but then if she wants to get up anywhere closer on the screen, she's got to actually hold the device so she can get her thumb up higher. Note how she has to pull that screen in. And all the touch targets are so small that they're not even registering what she's doing with it. And so this isn't just, lollygagging at data. When I do this breakdown of what are we talking about here, this is actually a critical part of understanding the experience so that we can design for it. Right? If we understand that it's predominantly one-handed use, predominantly portrait orientation, and predominantly this kind of form factor, we can use that as a baseline for creating software and for preventing people from having these kinds of experiences. Right? We understand the reality of what the mobile experience is like, and we can design accordingly. So, as we've seen, this growth in screens is really a growth in network connectivity, right? Screen time is online time because these screens are windows to software and the internet and the web. And as a result, we really need to understand screens so we can design for them. The first part of this is understanding that not all screens are equal, right? As I illustrated. There's some that are more important than others today, and that may change over time. But at least we keep our heads in the game by knowing that. The rest of the stuff I really want to talk about here is understanding what screens can do and what we can do with them. And that boils down to three things: output, input, and posture. So I want to walk through these three things, illustrate some ideas, and hopefully, again, they trigger questions in your head, stuff you want to dive deeper into. And why do I want to talk so much about these things? Again, I use this metaphor, if you will, like when an artist is crafting marble. The more they understand about the materials of the marble, the more they can do with it, right? Like, I love this quote. Isn't it amazing how he makes marble look like flesh? He's got to understand a lot about how to hit that marble, how to chisel it, how to buff it, all these kinds of things so that he can create the right experience. And this is, our medium are these devices, are these screens, our software. So how do we really understand those aspects so that we can make the right kind of experience, right? So we can craft that medium into what we want. And we'll start with output. So output, as you can guess, is what shows up on screens. And as I illustrated earlier, there are a whole bunch of different kinds of screens out there, right? That can render our content. And we talked a little bit about this gap in between smartphone and tablet, but truth is we've got to deal with a whole bunch of different kinds of screens. And luckily, over the past couple of years, we've actually developed some cool methodologies for dealing with these things. And so I'll talk over one really, really fast because I hope most of you are familiar with it, which is this idea of responsive web design. And what this allows you to do on web browsers is to have an experience that can fluidly change and then at certain points make switches to be optimized for a particular kind of device. So now you've got something that's a bit better for a small screen, and then when you stretch it out, you've got things that are better for a medium-sized screen, a large screen, what have you. And this is accomplished through a couple of things. One, they have a fluid grid. So as you can see, when the page actually stretches, things just sort of fill in the gaps. The other thing they do is they have fluid media, right? The images also similarly stretch. But the third part, which is perhaps the most interesting, is this thing called a media query. And what a media query does is, excuse me for the technical stuff, I promise I won't bore you with learning code. But what it does is it looks at a property of the screen, in this case the width of the screen, and it changes the presentation based on that property. So hey, how wide are you? Okay, I'm going to make a change based off of that. So that media query is an important way to design. It gives you an attribute of the screen, tells you something about that medium you're designing for, and allows you to change your design as a result of that attribute of the screen. And responsive design gives you a whole bunch of other things like access on many devices, one code-based deployment and URL. I won't dive too deep into this, but generally it gives you some good stuff. So the way people started working with this, so they'd sort of break these media queries. They'd say, oh, for a small size screen, do this. For a 10-inch tablet, do this. For a 10-inch tablet in landscape, do this. For a wide screen, do this. And then a small screen landscape and these kind of things. They originally started to break these things down by devices, and they'd change the presentation based on that device class. This can get relatively complicated, but there's actually a much simpler way of doing this. And they call these things breakpoints, which is where you put in this change. And it becomes much easier to understand a breakpoint if you think about it where your layout breaks. So what do I mean by that? Here's a very simple web page of a stunning man. And if you actually squeeze this page down, you'll note in that upper right-hand corner, that menu and that logo are about to get smushed together. The layout will break. It'll look like crap. So, ooh, fix it. Now the text is going to get really too short to read. So, ooh, fix it. That's it. You can do this the opposite way, too. You can stretch it out and be like, oh, these line links are getting too long to read. Fix it. Oh, now we've got this excess room. Drop in something to fix it. And you'll note, like, we don't really care about the size of the device there, right? It doesn't really matter if it's 768 or 820 or whatever. We just have a fluid layout that when something breaks, we adjust it. And it runs on all these different devices. And a lot of people will say, well, yeah, well, is it worth it, right? Is all this work to think about our design so fluidly and make these kinds of changes, is it worth it? I got a couple examples on that. Here's a very simple e-commerce site. And you can see they've got a mobile thing, and at some point they change it, and it's a desktop-y thing. Not rocket science here, right? They literally have one of these breakpoints. So it's a desktop-y thing, and then it becomes a mobile-y thing. That's it. One change, one breakpoint based off of a single media query. Again, a media query is tell me something about the screen so I can change as a result of it. And this change for these guys actually had some impact, right? When they did this redesign, they actually saw revenue growth on all the devices. That's cool. Because they got a nice conversion rate increase. Maybe they fixed up checkout a bit. Maybe they fixed up the view item page. Maybe they fixed up the shopping cart flow, what have you. But here's the more interesting thing. On smartphones, they had 350% revenue growth. And on tablets, they had 178% revenue growth. And what's important about this is a very simple principle. When you optimize an experience for a device, you get a return. I believe Jos yesterday talked about some of the reasons conversion's lower on smartphones rather than desktops and all that. And he had like reason 1, reason 2. I would like to add a reason, which is your experience sucks on mobile. It's not designed for it, right? That's a pretty darn big reason. And I'll show you some real cool examples later if you're interested about how to rethink those kinds of flows for mobile. Here's another example. Again, nothing too complicated. If you're a freak and you like shorts, these freak shorts may be for you. If you're not, then you can just observe, again, a very simple kind of view item page. And I'm using simple examples here just to show you this isn't rocket science. In fact, it's actually kind of broken-y at that size right there. Like, there's just like a single change here in this screen. But again, same kind of deal. iPhone, iPad revenue growth, way up. Android revenue growth, way up. Non-mobile revenue growth, doing OK. But the important thing here is on these particular devices, these things had a pretty big impact. One more, a little bit more sophisticated because they have a smallish screen layout. They have a medium-ish screen layout, and then they have a largish screen layout. Right? You can just see it really switching through those 3 states. Not as fluid as ideally this thing is. Instead, they just got like these 2 changes. But again, whoa, hey, look at that. But again, was a good redesign overall. Revenue went up, but mobile revenue per user way up. Mobile conversion increased way up. And mobile year-over-year traffic way up as well. Some of that is attributable to just mobile rising in general, but other things are, if you don't have a great mobile experience, people will bounce off. And just to show it's not just small companies that are doing it. This is Walmart. Walmart's got a similar experience for their e-commerce side. You can see it likewise moves through about 3 or so of these switch statements to change the layout as you adjust sizes. And they likewise had a nice impact here, in particular on mobile, 20% conversion increase in mobile orders. And it's not just e-commerce sites, right? Here's a recent example the MTV guys shared with me on their responsive redesign: increased mobile visits, increased mobile page views per visit, increased mobile time spent per visit, all this good stuff. And I emphasize in particular the larger numbers on mobile for one really important reason. Remember this chart? This is the big chart, and if you are moving things substantially on this chart, then you are having a really big impact, right? This chart, if you move things here, okay, this is where the growth is. In fact, looking at data from Staples here that they shared not too long ago, they make a similar point, which is that the repeat users are much, much higher on the desktop, but where they're seeing all their new customers coming from is from mobile. So you've got this huge growth in mobile. That's where your new customers are coming from. And if you can do something that increases conversion and revenue and time spent and all these good things substantially on mobile, then you're doing really good, right? It's like a double bonus round. Not only do you get this increased conversion, but you're putting it in the right place. So that's how we deal with various sizes of screens. Then there's other techniques we can talk about there. If you got questions about that, think about them. Ask me. We can dive deeper into responsive design and other techniques. Just kind of highlighting what are we doing there and why do we care. But as Tim Cook points out, going back to his quote earlier, they care about the display because they know it's the window of the software, but they don't just care about the size. That's what we were really adapting to there. How wide are you? Okay, let me change the layout. That's literally all you saw there. We also care about other aspects of the output. And as he points out, it's not just the size, but it's the resolution, it's the clarity. He lists a whole bunch of things that they care about. And I want to talk about resolution for half a second because this one is fascinating to me. When, during the PC era, right, during the laptop and desktop world, the average pixels per inch, which is a measure of resolution, how much resolution do we have on a screen, was about 100 pixels per inch. Then the first series of smartphones that had a full-size kind of display came out, and they were about 200 pixels per inch, which was a huge change. It's a big deal. Bless you. Then Apple came out with the Retina display. You guys remember this? Retina get in, the Retina apocalypse, whatever you want to call it. And they claimed 326 pixels per inch. The human eye can no longer see a pixel. So that's how high the resolution is. Then the Galaxy S4 came out with a 441 pixels per inch. This is 1080p on essentially a 5-inch screen. You starting to see the trend yet? My favorite, the LG Optimus Quad HD, which literally sounds like a bad Star Wars, Transformers character, right? Like this is the knockoff cousin of Optimus Prime, the LG Optimus Quad HD. This is a 5.5-inch screen with 538 pixels per inch. Not only can human beings not see a pixel, flies can't see a pixel on this thing. I just saw one recently, 672 pixels on a 5.5-inch screen. It's just crazy. To put this into perspective, that LG Quad Optimus LD 55, whatever the heck thing is a 5-inch screen. It has this many pixels, 2,560 by 1,440. That's how many pixels you get on a 27-inch cinema display. So we've taken the stuff you have on a 27-inch screen and put it in the palm of your hand. And a lot of people just view this as a problem. Oh man, now we got to make like high-resolution images. This sucks. Can't believe I got to make another image. But like, this is totally transformative, right? I think this is underappreciated. Instead of looking at this as a huge opportunity, wow, we have the resolution of a 27-inch screen in the palm of our hands. What can we do with it? Right? We view it as a problem. And this trend is only going to continue. Just to slide this over, this is a Dell, a 4K. It's actually Ultra HD. It's not full 4K, but it's 3,840 by 2,160, and it costs like $700 right now. Ultra HD is increasingly in reach. Apple just released the iMac Retina 5K because they always got to have like one bigger, right? 4K not good enough for us. They're 5K. You guys remember the battle of escalating razors? I don't know if you remember Gillette, right? It's like, fuck it all, we're doing 5 blades. Just be damned, we're going 5K. So let's zoom out for a second to really appreciate what's going on here. Let's look at this progression. We started with the standard definition kind of thing. And then all of a sudden we had HD, 720p. And then we have full HD, 1080p. Now we got Ultra HD and this little offset of it, 5K, 4K. And then we have 5K, right? This progression just keeps growing and growing and growing. And to put this into perspective, what does this mean for you guys? Well, if you have an Ultra HD screen, like that Dell screen, I'm not even going to jump into the 5K stuff. But if you're just looking at an Ultra HD thing, that means when you put an image like this on it, that image is 10 megabytes. That is a huge image. That is like when I travel here to Dublin and I have my little data plan that I paid $60 for, I can go to visit 5 of these web pages and I am done. That's it. So your web page better be freaking awesome. It just cost me $20 to view it. And then the techniques I showed you before with fluid images, right? They're awesome. They're amazing for adapting to these different screen sizes. But are you really going to serve a 10 megabyte image down to a phone with this kind of resolution? There's issues here, stuff to figure out. But increasingly, as we move up this HD ladder, as we move from standard definition to HD to Ultra HD, if you are selling anything, right, and you're using imagery, because people use images to make decisions all the time, if you're using dated imagery, right, it's going to actually have an impact. So we've got to figure this stuff out. And you may say, well, it's not like anybody uses full bleed images on the internet. How about like every frickin' person uses giant full bleed images on the internet? And every single site has these kinds of problems. And there's stuff you can do. Again, I'll skip some of the technical things, but there's new ways of thinking about how we render images, whether it's vector arts or whether it's CSS and these kinds of things on the web. But I will bring up another thing here, just to echo home this point. Remember that media query thing I told you about, which looks at the screen and tells us how wide is it. It can also look at the screen and tell us, is it high resolution or not? And then we can do stuff like turn up a high resolution image, and it uses it if it's high res, and if it's not, it uses a low res image. This is another example of us understanding the property of the screen. Right? I mentioned before, it was about screen time. Screens are the software to the world. So if we can say, hey, screen, what are you? How wide are you? Are you high resolution or not? We can adapt what we show to each device to fit it better. The other thing that's interesting about this trend from standard definition to 4K is our aspect ratios are changing. We're going from a 4:3 world to 16:9 to 19:10. And a lot of this, you may say, well, isn't that like media? Yeah, but in North America, half of downstream traffic is YouTube plus Netflix. It's video content, right? Half of downstream network traffic. So you can bet your bottom dollar that the device manufacturers know this, and they're creating devices that can actually view that kind of media. They're accounting for it. In fact, in the US, even back in 2013, the top selling devices, which were the 5S, the S4, the 5C, the One, and the Xperia Z, they were all 16:9 devices. So mobile devices are moving to this widescreen aspect ratio along with other devices. And if you look at that on a device like the Microsoft Surface 3, you can see this widescreen thing has an impact. So here's kind of a layout in landscape mode, and then you shift it over to portrait mode on one of these devices. And as you can see, probably time to change it up. Right? You get a very different experience in these two modes. The screens are quite different from an aspect ratio perspective. And again, we kind of want to know something about the screen and be able to adjust so that we can create the right content layout. And you may say, well, Luke, didn't you tell me 94% of smartphones are in portrait mode? I did. But when you get to tablets, things change. In tablets, it's more of a 50-50 split. In fact, I have a pretty fascinating chart that shows as screen size increases, the amount of landscape use grows. Which is kind of cool to see, right? Right around like 6 inches, it starts to go up a little bit, and then you get from 7 up to 11 inches. And at 11 inches, landscape mode is a much bigger deal than on any of the other ones. So as you make that progression of screens, you see this sort of transition happen. And it's pretty consistently about 50-50 across multiple data sets. So what do we do with this? What do we do with this kind of adjustment? Trent Walton wrote a little article, and again, I'm going to come back to this media query thing, not to be technical, but to illustrate how we react to screen properties, where he used not only the width of the screen, but the height of the screen to make some changes. And so what he was doing here with this vertical understanding of the screen was when somebody flipped the device into landscape mode, this is the experience they would get. And so what he would do is he would actually suppress a font increase so that you could read more stuff on the screen. All right, so if the screen's wide enough but not tall enough to make the fonts bigger, he would suppress it. So this is a pretty cool first step. He's essentially preventing things from getting bad on these wider screens. But we can do better. We can actually use these same techniques to make things better. So let me show you a very simple example. Here's a website, and as you can see, you get more to this widescreen aspect ratio. Notice how we're cutting down on vertical space and then opening it up so more things fit. Very simple. Here's another one. Which Paris girl are you? What if you visited on screen like that? Don't worry, you can still get started. And I love this example because a lot of people will, have these conversations. What about the fold? Right, I have to have the call to action above the fold. We can talk about that later. But here's the thing you can do. It's like, oh yeah, where's the fold, man? Huh? Where's the fold? Where's the fold? Oh yeah, it's over here. Huh? Where's it now? Where's it now? So that critical call to action of which Paris girl are you will never get lost on screen. But you can start to see the implications of this stuff for landing pages, right? For places where you care about conversion. Making sure that critical information is visible on a variety of screens, making sure that critical calls to action are in the appropriate places. So with these short and wide screens, right, there's just like two very simple techniques. One thing you can do is tighten stuff up. That's kind of one way of creating an optimal experience on these screens. Another thing you can do is move up calls to action to ensure they're immediately visible. And so there's a bunch of things that you can do here. And again, you may say, well, that seems like work. Yeah, it's work. But remember what happens when you build an experience that's optimized for a particular device, you all of a sudden start to see great returns on those particular kinds of devices. This is my reason 3 thing. I'm the design guy, so I'm telling you how to use the design stuff to have the outcomes that you guys want to have. Here's another example. So now, okay, great, we've got this cool widescreen mode thing going on. But what happens when you then flip it to vertical mode? In this case, our landscape mode looks nice, right? Here's this big fat map. Here's some information about the map. Here's some menu systems and the like. And then we flip it over to portrait mode and everything goes to hell. Because now we have this tiny sliver of a map. You can barely see anything. There's these big, long menus running up and down the sides. So that's not cool. Maybe what we can do using some of these techniques is move that menu over here, rearrange the menus. Now we got more room for content. But now we've moved menus around on people. That's not so great. So what if instead we take that menu, put it off screen, and now we keep that UI there? Well, that's also not so great. So let's just push it down to the bottom of the screen where it's actually more usable and take the menu off the screen. And ta-da, we've got a layout that works really well for this kind of device. And again, you can see clearly, this is a very simple example, you can see clearly how the experience is now much better through just 2 simple changes based off the property of the screen. So here are a couple techniques. We can move menus off canvas. We can talk about those techniques if you like. We can reposition things at the bottom, and off we go. OK, so to ensure our software displays the best way across screens, we need to appreciate a lot of aspects of output, right? Output is one of these things we care about. There's this high resolution issue to deal with. There's this screen size issue to deal with. There's aspect ratios to think about. And we have this technique, at least on the web, and you can sort of do this in native apps as well, although there's other techniques for it. You look at the property of that screen and you make adjustments to your software. Now let's talk about input. All right, if output ensures our software displays well across screens, input is what we put into them, right? It's the input side of the coin. What do we get into the screens as opposed to what we get out of the screens? And I've shown a couple Apple quotes, so now I'll shift gears and show Mr. Steven Sinofsky, who used to head up Windows. And don't ask me what he's doing there, sort of like this religious moment, I guess, as the children fawn over the latest Surface tablet. Yeah, I know, awkward picture, right? I had to use it. Once I saw it, I had to use it. He has a really great quote, though, which says, any piece of glass that you can't interact with is going to feel broken. And what he's talking about is another trend, which very similar to the growth of screen sizes as well. This is touchscreen revenue, and you can see the exact same trend line. Not only are all these pieces of glass emerging, but more and more of these pieces of glass are interactive, right? They have touch. And if touch wasn't hard enough to deal with, as you saw that poor woman on the airplane just trying to make her way through the cat photos in her Facebook feed, if it wasn't hard enough just to get that right, consider it's not just multi-touch, right? You can still have a keyboard in here or add one if you want. And if you really want to go crazy, well, there's a front camera, there's a gyroscope, there's voice, there's a digital compass, there's GPS, there's an accelerometer, there's another camera, there's the ability to connect to other devices on this. Right? There's all kinds of inputs on this device, all kinds of different ways to collect data and information from people when you're trying to get them to buy or convert or whatever it is your business goals are. On a device like this, not only do you have multi-touch, but it comes default with a pen for writing on the screen, comes with a cursor in the form of a trackpad, default's got a keyboard. And it's not just these weird lablet, tab-top, hybrid, convertible, ultrabook, 2-in-1. I think I've used every phrase in the industry there. Devices. You know, a mobile device can have multi-touch, it can have a cursor, and it can have a keyboard. All right, lots of different kinds of input. In fact, I'm so obsessed with this stuff, I made like this mega chart. It's just like, hold on, I'll explain what I'm talking about here. But this is just one manufacturer. This is Apple, and these are their different form factors. They got a wrist-based form factor, a phone-based form factor, a tablet-based form factor, a laptop, and a desktop. And then these are all the different kinds of inputs that they're supporting right now. Multi-touch, force touch, fingerprint, keyboard, cursor, back camera, front camera, Bluetooth, GPS, barometer, NFC, accelerometer, gyroscope, light sensor, digital compass, proximity sensor, microphone, heart rate sensor, and digital crown. And you know, depending on what you look at, it's got different levels of those inputs. This is fascinating to me. Right? And the reason why I say this is fascinating to me, I describe my job as I make boxes for people to fill in on computers. And you may say, well, what does that mean? Well, Google is a box that people fill in on computers. You may have heard of it. eBay is a box that people fill in on computers. Right? All this stuff where there's contribution, where people can, Ecommerce is essentially a box that people fill in on computers through checkout. Facebook is a box that people fill in on computers. So there's a couple opportunities there, but one of the big ones is, how do they fill in that box? Do they always have to type? Can they use one of these other ways to fill it in? Really interesting things we could dig into there as well. And a lot of people's reactions to these different types, input types was, well, can't we just sort of like figure out what kind of input they have and make a change? And this was the original reaction to especially touch. They'd be like, well, okay, we can have a touch-based interface, right? So here's the multi-touch version of your calendar, and then we'll have the cursor and keyboard version. All we have to do is figure out what you support, not to mention the fact that you can constantly changing. Now, this is not an unreasonable idea. In fact, with our last startup, we had this idea. We had a mobile-optimized experience for the smartphone. And then when we moved to a larger size screen, what we wanted to do is, as you expand to that screen size, we wanted to allow you to interact with it with a keyboard. So what we wanted to do is, if there's a keyboard attached to your device, here's a real shortcut, fast way of getting things done. So we wanted to surface this tip for people that have a keyboard. Doesn't sound too bad, right? And so what we did was try to figure out, does device have touch? And in some cases, we could figure out if device has touch. In other cases, we couldn't actually figure out if device has touch. And every time you try to do this, like switching modes and designing for one specific input type at a time, you realize it's not going to work. Instead, what you actually need to do is not attempt to switch between these things and just support as many as you possibly can. And let me illustrate that with an example. So here is a little creation form where you can go and edit some imagery. And the way this works is, with touch, you can move images around here. You can sort of resize them. So if you've got any kind of touch interface, whether it's a small screen or big screen, you can use pinch and zoom to make things bigger. You can slide things around with your fingers, and ta-da, in an interactive format, you can get those images to do what you like. When you move beyond the mobile screen, you can still use touch across the board, but as that screen size increases, what we're actually going to do is surface the ability for you to use other capabilities. So we bring up these little tips around how you can use mouse. So with the mouse, you can use scroll, the scroll wheel, to zoom in and out of here. You can use double click like this, right? Like this, to fit it. There you go. And so we surface these tips that allow you to use multiple input types. So it doesn't matter if you have a cursor, it doesn't matter if you have a mouse. In fact, you can use the scroll wheel, you can use a double click, you can use touch, you can use all kinds of stuff. We just support all of it. And what we do, and this is kind of cheating, but I'm going to tell you this anyway, we basically say, okay, if it's small, more likely there's not a keyboard. If it's big, likelier chance there's a keyboard. It's kind of cheating, but why this is cheating is because you're not going to do this for voice, right? Why it's cheating is we don't really have one of these media query type things, at least on the web right now, that tells us, does this have a fine finger kind of cursor or pointer? Does this have hover? They've proposed making these things. But it would be really, really awesome if you could, again, query the screen and be like, are you a touch screen? Do you have a keyboard attached to you? Do you have a pen, right? What do you support? And then you can make adjustments to your interface as a result of it. So with input, there's lots of different input types out there. While your first inclination may be to break things down and segregate by input types, it's just not going to work in practice. And there's a lot of great techniques for actually being able to support a bunch of stuff. What we've gravitated to is support all the stuff, but let people know what's possible. So surface, like those little mouse tips if you can, or those keyboard tips. And we're using screen size to kind of guess where there's a keyboard or not, but that's not the best thing to do. And for now, on the web this will change. On native you can get away with a lot of these things, but on the web it's not as robust as you'd like. All right. Last but not least, right? We talked about the growth in screens, display and network connectivity. Talked about how we want to understand attributes of our screen so we can design for them, output and input. And there's another really, really interesting part to this equation. Because when you do design work, it's not just the device that's driving it, right? It's not just what kind of output does this device have, what kind of input does this device have. Those are two very important things to consider because they determine how you lay out your interface and all these kinds of things. But the other piece to this equation, to understanding this cross-device design, is really how do people interact with that output and input, right? We're not designing for devices, we're designing for human beings. And so what is people's relationship to those input methods? What is people's relationship to those outputs, right? How do they kind of fit in to the whole thing? So earlier I mentioned Netflix and YouTube are responsible for 50% of downstream traffic in North America. How have they managed to be that successful, right? How do they have this experience that supports 50% of downstream internet traffic? It turns out math has something to do with it. In fact, they employ very tall mathematicians to get stuff done, like a 10-foot UI guy here. There's also a 2-foot UI guy, an 18-inch guy. Anyway, before you start thinking the wrong things, what they're actually talking about here is viewing distance, right? The job of 10-foot guy is to create an interface for the 10-foot away viewing experience. That's because the average viewing distance for a TV is 10 feet away. The job of 2-foot guy, he deals with laptops and desktops because the average viewing distance on a laptop is 2 feet away. 18-inch guy is the one who does tablets. And why does this matter for Netflix? What's going on here? Well, let's look at how Netflix's customers watch the service. And as you know, they're on a lot of devices, right? It's a cross-device world, as you guys have heard a bunch. So 44% of Netflix's customers will watch on a laptop or PC at some point. 23% will watch on a smartphone, 17% on a smart TV, 16% will connect a PC to a TV, 15% on a tablet, Blu-ray player, Wii, PS3, Xbox 360, and the list goes on to 500 more SKUs and devices. That is a lot of devices. And if you start thinking about things in isolation as just a device, you really quickly get overwhelmed. It's impossible to keep up with 500 different kinds of devices and have a specific experience for each one. It will drive you mad. In fact, it drove these guys mad. If instead you take these 500 SKUs and you break it down to a question of posture, to a human experience on these devices, you actually simplify the equation a lot. Because what you'll see is across all these different SKUs, about 83% of their customers have a 10-foot experience, 44% 2-foot, 23% 1-foot, and 15% 1.5 feet. Here we're talking about posture. And so now you go from 500 things, for designing for 500 things, to designing for 4 things. Huge difference, right? 500 versus 4. Tremendous difference. And what does this look like, right? Let's actually look at this in detail. So on a smartphone, 23% of Netflix's customers view the service on a smartphone. So when they're browsing this list of movies to watch, they're about a foot away from the screen. They're about 12 inches away from the screen. So this is their viewing distance. And so what they do is they size the box art at about 1 inch. And notice I'm using physical dimensions here because we're talking about posture, talking about how human beings and their bodies relate to our software. So we're not using pixels, and also pixel density and all this stuff mixes it up, but we're using physical dimensions. So it's sized at 1 inch for the smartphone. When you move to 18 inches, which is about 1.5 feet, that's the average viewing distance for a tablet, and you go and measure the box art change here, it's now at 1.75 inches tall. It's essentially this very similar UI, as you can see. It's kind of the same UI. But what they're doing is they're resizing the elements based on people's relationship to the screen. Your finger size hasn't changed, right? But the box art, the viewing distance has changed. When you get up to a 2 foot away viewing experience, a laptop desktop experience, right? So now you're 24 inches away, 2 feet. The size of the box art is now 2.25 inches. Again, very, very same layout, same basic thing. When you move to the 10 foot away experience, the lean back experience, if you will, so now we're on a TV 10 feet away, you can no longer see the guy. The box art here is sized at 5.25 inches physically. So let's look at this in aggregate, right? Looking at all these changes together, you can see this progression. At 10 inches, it's 5.25. At 24 inches, 2, and this whole thing. In fact, if you really want to, you can just throw a math formula on this. It's about 1/2 inch per foot. It breaks down on the smartphone. There's some studies that say average viewing distance on a smartphone is 10 inches, a lot that say 12 inches. If you plug in 10 inches, this formula actually works. And I was trying to hunt down this secret formula because there's this Silicon Valley lore about Neil Hunt, who's a chief product officer at Netflix. There's a Silicon Valley lore that he walked into this thing called a video store. Have you guys heard of this thing? Nobody knows? Okay, I'll tell you what it was like, because I've heard them talk about it. So this video store was a store that you went into, and they had pictures of the movies you could get that would come in a big plastic box with tape inside. And you would take that plastic box home. No? You have no clue. Okay. That's all right. But what would happen in these video stores is they would arrange the boxes on shelves, and they would space the rows out appropriately so you could view the boxes. And so what would happen is, or what supposedly happened is Neil Hunt went to a video store back in the day, and he stood at the right distance where he could see the box art well, and he measured how far away he was, and he measured the size of the box art and came up with this formula for sizing things. I don't know if it's true or not, right? But like, we love our little stories here. So loosely, it's 1/2 inch per square foot. But you can start to see how this kind of thinking about posture really gives you a much simpler way to deal with interfaces, right? And this is nothing new, right? The idea for accounting for viewing distance has been around in design for a long time. This is the manual for how you size type in the London Underground. The further away the sign, the bigger the font, right? Kind of a duh. So it hasn't really been an issue in screen design. People haven't thought about this in screen design until you take posture into account. If you're just looking at the input and output properties as a screen and not thinking about the human being in the equation, you don't think about things like viewing distance. But they can have a pretty big impact. Let me talk about a couple other elements of posture, and then I'll let you guys go have a snack and stew on ideas. Let's start, let's come up to this TV thing. Because I said looking at just the input and output doesn't help you. Why doesn't it help you? Because a 50-inch HD TV has 920 by 1080 pixels. It's 1080p. So does a 5-inch Galaxy S4. So if you're just looking at the device and saying, how many pixels you got? Right? You're going to end up with the same number. But that's a 10-foot away experience, and this is a 1-foot away experience. And you don't want to serve the same interface to 10 feet away as you want to serve to 12 inches away. In fact, on devices like the Xbox One, where you can log a web page or an app on the side of a TV, the width they use there is actually the same device width you get on a mobile device. But like, do you really want just like a mobile website pinned to the side of your TV? We did a project with Microsoft on this, where we actually enabled, and I can maybe show a video of it in a second, we actually enabled this to happen, but we had to totally redesign that experience for the 10-foot away view as opposed to the 1-foot away view. And this isn't just TVs. Remember I was showing you the HTC Vision, talking about the Oculus. There's also this thing called Glass, which Tony Fadell is now supposedly going to make amazing, because the first version wasn't so great. But it's a heads-up display, right? Kind of the eye form factor. And in this eye form factor, the way Glass renders a screen, it's a little screen floating in the sky above you, but it's the equivalent of viewing a 25-inch HD screen about 8 feet away. In reality, it's got 640 by 360 pixels or so. And so that's kind of the screen you're dealing with in this broadcast over your eye kind of worldview, which is fascinating to think of. But it has a web browser. It uses a dynamic web viewport to size websites, and it uses 960 to scale things down. So if you were trying to look up finance information and you bring up Yahoo Finance on Glass, it kind of looks like this on this little screen. Who think that good? Not so good. Well, but we got responsive design, right? So we're going to look at the viewport, which is the device width is 640, so we'll render this. Is that any good? The way Glass renders financial information looks kind of like this. It actually looks like a display board that you'd see on the wall further away. This is how it renders Wikipedia. This is how it renders ESPN. So that's another aspect, right, of it. One more thing in posture to consider is how we actually hold and interact with screens. I talked about this one-handed use and how our fingers interrelate with this stuff. It turns out this is important for devices as well. Because with tablets, we tend to hold them like so. With touch-based laptops, it's very common to grip them on the sides of the screen and use your fingers. And in fact, in Microsoft's Windows design, they've actually accounted for this. They have controls on the sides of the screen in apps so that you can have your persistent commands over here, you can have your distinct command sets over there, and the idea is to make things more ergonomically accessible. Many of you are probably feeling this as you move to larger size phones. For those of you who have moved to a larger size phone, you may have realized, oh, I used to have this comfortable one-handed grip, and now I can't get up to that darn corner, right? This happened to anyone? Ow! Again, this has an impact on how we design because it turns out for our hands, there's easy to get to areas, hard to get to areas. And as screen size changes, you can see that ow zone, if you will, versus the good zone starts to change, and there's certain parts that are really painful to get to. And you can really quickly see how this would impact how you design your software, right? Again, let's look at the property of the screen and make some changes. In this case, we're also considering how our bodies, what is a comfortable grip for our hands? What is the size of our thumbs that we use on these devices? How do we change stuff? Well, maybe we'll put commonly used actions down on the bottom of the screen. In this case, what I actually did is I inverted the list. So I sorted it by most common on the bottom as opposed to on top. Small change, but possibly worth it. The Android Material UI design guidelines have this thing called the floating menu control, which you can put in the bottom right-hand corner and allow people to access it there. And then it can actually bring up menu controls there. But even simpler stuff. This is a before and after of Foursquare's Swarm app. And the primary action on Swarm is to check into places. And so it used to be up here in the upper right-hand corner in the ouch zone, and now it's down here in the natural, easy-to-hit zone. So you can start to see how this has an impact on our UI design as well. One other element to posture. So far we've talked about things like viewing distance, right? The fact that this is 10 feet away. We've talked about the size of our hands and how they interrelate to how we hold screens. But there's also environmental things, like generally if you're viewing things on a TV, you're probably in a lower light situation. And our devices can adapt to this stuff too. Our screens can be inclusive of this information. If anybody's used navigation controls on their phone, you'll note that at some point When it gets dark out, it inverts. It's using an ambient light sensor on the device as input and inverting the controls so you can actually see what you're doing. You don't have to just use this on driving apps. You can actually use it on reading apps as well. And again, this is an attribute that they're proposing we use in this media query spec soon. You can have a light level, which they can then use to change the UI. And again, I don't expect you to know the technical things about this, but the interesting thing to me about media queries is here's a consistent format by which you can ask the device, how wide are you? How tall are you? Are you high resolution? Do you have touch? Do you have hover controls? What's the light like where you are? You can just have that stuff and associate some style changes based on that property. And all of a sudden, voila, you have an adaptable interface that not only changes based off screen size, but also changes based on the resolution of the screen, changes whether the screen's used in the dark or in the light, right? Changes based on whether or not the screen has a keyboard attached to it or not. This is kind of a new way of designing these things that takes into account all the possibilities of these different devices, which is pretty fascinating, right? So posture is how people interact with the output and input of the display. Viewing distance, grip position, environment. It uses things like physical dimensions and that kind of stuff. So let me summarize this and let you guys go out, get some coffee, and wake up. We talked about this world of glass, right? 1/2 square foot of LCD screens sold per person on the planet every year. That is a lot of glass. That glass is important because it's our window to software. And we need to understand these screens because these screens are the windows to our businesses. These screens are the windows to the interactions that either allow us to help people, to get them content, to let them accomplish a task, or to allow us to make money. Right? That screen increasingly is mobile. I sort of broke down how would I define the mobile experience? 4 to 5.5 inches, portrait, one-handed use. That's how you can kind of think about understanding the screen today. And then the properties, output, high resolution, widescreen. We can use a lot of responsive design techniques to account for this on the web. And then there's other less flexible ways in native apps, but they're getting more flexible. Both iOS and Android are now introducing more fluid reflow layout capabilities that allow us to do similar kinds of things in native. Input, while it's tempting to split all these different input types, we actually want to support as many as possible and just let people know what they can do with each. And last but not least, there's posture, right? Viewing distance, environment, and more. All these things allow us to build for screens and for glass. Now, if you're the type who likes to ask questions, which I hope you are, a natural question, which actually Mr. Steven Sinofsky, who formerly headed up Windows, asks is, what material comes after glass? What's the disruption? Right? So today we're making all these screens, but is this really how we're going to interact with stuff? Are we really going to be always looking at glass through screens? And you could answer this question a number of different ways. Focusing on material, you could say, well, maybe sapphire is going to take over for glass. Corning is very afraid of sapphire. In fact, they have released multiple press releases that say, why sapphire sucks compared to Gorilla Glass. You can sort of smell the fear on their PR sheet. What about voice interfaces? Certainly been a lot of conversation about those, no pun intended. Right? The problem with voice interfaces is all of you guys can browse Facebook right now, but if you had to do it with your voice, it would get really awkward really fast. So I don't think voice is going to become an every time kind of thing right now. What about wearables? Is that going to really break things up? So this one's actually very interesting to me because if you look at this, right? Remember this chart I showed at the beginning? The question to me about wearables, is it going to really complement or disrupt this line? Will wearables move this line higher because you have to have phones to use wearables? Or are wearables going to do something similar to mobile devices that mobile devices did to PCs? And the reason why I asked that question, I actually have a real clear reason for it. When we move from desk and lap-sized screens, like desktops and laptops, right? When we made that transition to palm-sized screens, to these mobile devices, what happened? Well, the equation ended up like this. Time spent on mobile has gone, time spent on desktop has gone. That was kind of the net outcome. And those lines continue to split from each other. Now, when you go from a palm-sized screen to a when you go from a palm-sized screen to a wrist-sized screen, what happens? The reason why I think this is actually a question worth asking is I made this diagram of device use per day. And so like you essentially wake up, your smartphone's on your bedside table, you look at it, you check your email and Facebook feed and all that stuff, right? It's how you stumble into your day. And then in the commute, increasingly inside cars and all these places, they've got full-on dashboards. So I'll make my way from my phone to my car, I'll have my digital maps there, I'll have my podcasts, all that fun stuff. At work, I go between the desktop monitor at my desk to the laptop to the phone. I kind of use all of those pretty interchangeably at work. After work, back commute, now I'm on the TV, I'm on the car control again. Then I get home, right, and may play some video games with the kids on a network screen, may watch a movie, may poke around on the phone a little bit. At night in bed, whip out the tablet to read a book. And, of course, check the phone at the end, right? But like this is kind of a multi-device flow, a cross-device flow. Granted, it's perhaps Silicon Valley-ized, but the future is here. It's just not evenly distributed yet, right? To quote William Gibson. And the thing that's fascinating to me about wearables is they're always on, always visible. So when you look across this entire day, from the moment you get up to the moment you go to bed, the screen that's on your body is always on your body and always accessible. Which is why I think, this is a question worth asking. I don't have an answer to this by any means, but then again, very few people had answers to what was going to happen to mobile. At the very least, a hell of a lot of people had doubts that this chart on the right was going to be true, right? It may not be that they had questions. They just didn't believe that this was going to go down. So wearables, interesting question as we think about what's going to happen next. Now, Corning, for one, remember I started this story off talking about Corning in 1952 and their R&D efforts. Corning, for one, is not sitting still. Right? They're not waiting for this stuff to hit them. In fact, they have a new experimental glass in the works. It's called Willow. And as you can see here, Willow is very flexible glass. It has almost a full bend here. It's thinner than a dollar bill. It's ultra hard. And they believe that it is going to help them grow into the flexible displays market, which they expect to reach about 800 million units in 2020. Now, I don't know about you. I don't have any displays that work like this yet. So maybe this is going to go back on their shelves like 0317 did until Steve Jobs knocked on Wendell Weeks' office door. Or maybe one of you will be the one who finds a use for this stuff and goes and yells at Wendell to make them some awesome things. I don't know. It's certainly an interesting area, and the future of screens and screen time is pretty cool. So with that, I want to say thanks for hearing me out. This is, again, things that were on my mind. When we come back from the break, I believe we got a 15-minute break or so, I want to hear about things on your mind, and I will just take questions, start answering them, we'll go from there. Thank you.